There's a great value in slowing down and pausing as a practice. The practice of pausing gives us a space to discover that there's a lot more to who we are than what we think. What we think is a piece of a much bigger picture. When we pause, we start to notice that there's a lot of space around what we think, a lot of openness and clarity that has little to do with the content of our thoughts that are so involved with a past that is essentially over and a future that hasn't come yet. So the practice of pausing gives us this chance to notice this space of this present moment and to inhabit it fully with our body and with our awareness and with our heart. Pause also allows us to contact the non-conceptual in our experience, and in that non-conceptual lives feeling and emotion. And I think in the context of the kind of challenges we're facing as a world, being in touch with that world of feeling is even more critical. In that world of feeling lives love and compassion. Love and compassion are not ideas. They are a movement of the heart, and they are embodied. So when we pause, we give ourselves this chance to discover love and compassion as an unfolding of our deeper being. When we pause, we also find the possibility that the answers that we seek are not as far as we thought. Often we turn to the outer world for our answers. We turn to the media, we turn to other wise beings, which is a good thing, but there is a kind of wisdom that is alive in us in the present moment. So the pause gives us this opportunity to discover what lies within that may, in fact, have the answers to the questions that we are seeking answers to in this time when the questions are so big and so critical. Like, how will we move forward in the face of an environmental crisis that seems insurmountable, even with all of the technology and science that we have? Some of the challenges we face are political. Some of the challenges we face are social. Some of the challenges we face are in the human heart. So the pause gives us this space to find a different way and inquire within. And finally, the pause helps us notice something that we miss almost every moment of our lives, and that is the fullness of our experience in the present moment, the fullness of color and sound and the truth of our embodied being right now. We miss it. We are so caught up in our thoughts, in our worries, in our expectations, in our fears, that we miss that fullness. In that fullness is found sufficiency. There's more than enough in this moment to fill our human heart with joy and with gratitude and with wonder right now. So the pause gives us this space to discover that maybe all the things we've been looking for and seeking are not any further than this present moment. There's power in the pause. So we're a culture that places so much emphasis on production and on intelligence and intellect and our ability to create and express. We might say, in the terms of an Eastern paradigm, we are a yang culture. Yang is sort of the energy, and yin-yang, right? You've heard of this yin-yang dichotomy. Yang is the energy that is forceful and outwards and action-oriented and in the world. We're very good at that as a culture. In America, in Europe, in the West, we're really good at that. We don't have much of a listening culture. I think in our society, often listeners are seen as passive, not even particularly powerful if they are not the ones delivering the message. We've missed, in that paradigm, we miss something that is a deep practice for transformation, and that is the act of listening, but not ordinary surface listening. I'm talking about something that we might call, that is actually commonly referred to now in the Buddhist world and some other contexts also, as deep listening. And deep listening is a kind of pouring of our whole attention into the act of listening as a practice that creates space and openness in the environment in which that listening exists. It's a kind of listening that is open, receptive, discerning, but non-judgmental. A kind of listening that comes not just from the faculty of the ear and the analytical mind, but a listening that listens for being, for presence. Also, deep listening, we might say, is embodied listening. It's possible to actually inhabit listening as a bodily practice, so that we're noticing as we listen how we are responding with our body, and that cues us in to a subtler part of ourself, the responsiveness of the inner self to what we hear. And that responsiveness can be a compassionate moment, could also be an anxious moment. So sometimes what we hear makes us anxious. But when we notice that in the body, we can attend to it with awareness and with compassion so that we can continue to listen. Now the problem, if we don't have this culture of deep listening, is essentially we are a culture in which we are listening to the loudest and most articulate voice in the room, but we are not necessarily listening to the wisest voice in the room. So a practice of deep listening helps us get deeper with our own discernment and to connect with listening as an active practice and an offering of compassion to the one who is speaking. Listening is also a form of giving care. In a way, I think that this crisis, the environmental crisis, is a crisis of not having listened deeply and still not listening deeply to this earth. We're not listening deeply to the oceans. We're not listening deeply to the forests. We're not listening deeply to the many species that are around us. We're not even noticing their presence. So listening, we could also say deep listening, is a practice of open noticing and an ability to absorb the messages that are coming in from many, many sides. If we were a culture of deep listening, it would be hard to continue down the path that we're going. We would hear the cries of the birds when we destroy their environment. We would hear the cries of the insects when we dig up and mine the land. We would know, but we haven't listened well. So now is a time, in this particular moment of our history as human beings, when we could imagine a world of deep listening to each other, but also to the earth as a practice. No longer being the ones who are just commanding the earth to do our bidding, but now it's time for us to shut up and listen to the earth, to see what it has to say. There's a lot of wisdom there. So what is required to sustain this work for the long haul? There's lots that's required, of course, in the outer world. And on that front, there are many scientists and great thinkers and even some politicians who may be able to answer that much better than I could. But I could say something about inner resources. I do believe that is a side of what we'll need in this long journey to transform our lives so that we can keep going in harmony on this earth. I think especially, I think of three things. The first is we'll need wisdom, especially the wisdom that is able to hold the truth that we know with grace. I'm really talking here about the truth of climate change, the truth of global warming, the truth of the extinction of many species. Be able to hold that truth with grace. That kind of wisdom. Even before we get there, we need to spend some time absorbing and perhaps grieving. We have to move through that grief into a place of wisdom. And I think that place of grieving, it should be honored. It's natural to feel concerned, even despairing in the face of what we see. But we have to move through that. And to move through that, we'll need some practices of holding the truth with grace. Maybe many ways, many practices, from religious traditions perhaps. I see the practice of meditation as that kind of practice, learning to hold truth with grace. But I think there are many practices out there that might be possible to draw on for this wisdom to come forth. The second resource that I think we will need in this time of transition is the resource of compassion. And when we hear the word compassion, I don't know about you, but when I heard it growing up, I often heard that as a kind of a soft and yielding way of being, a way of being that is tender and that makes compromises, and is perhaps even a kind of a wish to give and be of service. But the side that I didn't hear, and this is what I think we need, is fierceness. I think what we need as a resource is fierce compassion. And fierce compassion is not wishy-washy. Fierce compassion upholds other beings in their basic goodness and challenges them when they fall away from that. So if you think of that in terms of our situation on the planet, it means being able to honor all of life and to also be able to see honestly where we are destroying life and to not be okay with it. That we have to have some fierceness in our compassion as a resource. Loving, but loving like a mother protects her only child. This earth is our only child. It's the only one we've got. So we'll need some strong compassion to make it survive, to allow it to survive. And the third resource I think we will need is a return back home. And what I mean by that is a kind of rediscovery within ourselves and within our world of the sacredness of the wild and the free. I think that's a state of mind that we have innately. We are wild and free deep down in each of us. And I also think it's the truth about who we are as living beings. We are wild creatures, and we've forgotten that we are wild creatures. We have forgotten that the earth is our home. We have forgotten that we come from the wilderness, and when we die, we will go back into that wilderness. So that kind of return to the wild, I think, is the third resource that we'll need. We can do that as practices of being in nature, practices of sitting with the deep truth of who we are as beings, as sentient beings, being wild and free at heart, having a Buddha within. We can return to those practices. We can come home to who we really are.